In this video, we are going to go over everything you need to know to make a mosaic with ceramic tiles, step by step. Let's get started. Materials. I have included the full list of materials in the description. Step 1. Transfer design. We're going to copy the design onto tracing paper. Personally, I like to transfer the entire design, but you might prefer to transfer piece by piece as you cut, which is especially useful if you don't have paper as big as the size of your base. First, I'm going to outline the edge of the design. This helps me define the end of my pieces so they don't stick out past the edge. I'm going to adhere the tracing paper to the base, so it's easier to copy the design without it shifting. Step 2. Cutting and addition. To cut the pieces into the exact shapes we want, we will draw each one on the tiles. First, we have to mark the pieces on both designs. I will start with this flower, so this petal will be 1, 2, 3. I will start with this petal. We place the petal here. Try to make the most of your tiles. With a pencil, trace the design on the inside. It doesn't need to actually write. Just press down to transfer through the carbon paper. I draw the design with a thicker marker to simulate the width of the grout line. So, when we trace the pieces to cut, we'll do it using the inner section of the drawing. This way, we ensure there is an even space for the grout. Apply firm pressure so the design transfers well onto the tile. Sometimes it's helpful to have two colors of carbon paper. For example, if you are working with a black tile, using black paper makes it difficult to see the transferred line. In that case, you can use rather blue paper. Here we have our first drawn piece. We're going to mark the tile with the glass cutter. This is probably the most challenging step if you're just starting out, but the truth is that it just requires practice, and from the beginning, you'll be able to make very good cuts. Let's mark the outline. You should hear that sound. You don't have to mark the entire piece in one go, but try to pick up where you left off without going over the same spot. And, as I always say, we don't need perfect cuts. Though they are always nice, they are not strictly necessary. That oily look is just a bit of paraffin I applied to the wheel to help it glide more smoothly. To make the cut, place the piece centered inside the running pliers and press down. The idea is to align that line with the one on the tile. Hold it and press. It's very important that the running pliers can fully grip the piece. This part here shouldn't be cut with the running pliers, so I'll use the tile nipper. Because you'll have to press more, and the piece could break easily. Sometimes the cuts won't come out right, and you'll have to try again, which is why it's always good to have some extra material on hand. For the rest, we use these pliers to start trimming. Since it's already marked, it will be easier. Try to follow the line we marked closely. And make sure the edges don't stick out too much. A little bit is fine. Don't cut into the glaze when trimming the edges, because you might crack it, unless it's a piece that ended up outside the cut line. We can save these larger pieces. They might be useful for a border piece or another project, so I sell them aside. And as for the smaller ones, you swap them away. These tools are super practical and affordable. Never drag them with your hand, because you'll cut yourself. Keep your workspace clean and continue. Different pieces will have varying levels of cutting difficulty. Some will require the running pliers, which will make things much easier, but other times you won't be able to use them. For example, this piece with a very curved section could be attempted with the running pliers. But since it's not a straight line and curves a lot, it's likely to break. So, I'll consider this piece lost and trim it little by little. We'll slowly work our way toward the point, being very careful because it might break. Now, if it breaks multiple times, you might want to divide the piece in two. I've cut the 3 petals of the flower, so I'm going to mark them here to avoid confusion. And then we'll start gluing. I like to glue once I have a certain numbers of pieces, but some people prefer to cut everything before gluing, or glue each piece right after cutting. You'll have to find your own style. Since this vase is wood, we'll use PVA glue. You don't need to apply too much glue to avoid it squeezing out. Always make sure there are no small particles under the piece before marking it, as they can cause the piece to break by leaving an uneven surface underneath. Another useful tip: try to extend the cutting line all the way to the edge. Like in this case, we should do something like this. That way, when we cut the piece, it will break cleanly. If we don't, it might break in a direction we don't want, splitting the piece. Even if the main shape stays intact, it could ruin this part that I want to use for other sections. This is how you cut the piece. So now I'll keep cutting and make sure I don't lose that section. For the stems, I found it was better to cut thin strips in the end, but for your first project, that might not be the best idea. A lot of pieces will break. In that sense, I recommend starting with larger pieces. Common beginner projects include mandalas or butterflies. I was cutting these blue pieces and I noticed exactly what I said earlier. If you look here, the carbon paper didn't mark well. So, what we can do in this case is use a marker to trace over those areas again to help us visually. I finished the entire main figure of this piece, and now I'm going to start with the edges. What I'm doing here is cutting strips of about the same width, since I'm not following a specific pattern, but rather assembling it based on what I have. In this case, I'm doing it in two ways, with the running pliers or with the tile nipper. Earlier, I mentioned that it's not ideal to use the running pliers when it can't fully grip the piece, but in this case, I don't need very specific shapes, and even if the strips come out shorter, it still works for me. Here I marked a few. If they don't cut all the way through, that's okay, but it worked pretty well. This one didn't work, but I might be able to salvage a piece. Another option is with the tile nipper, and cross my fingers that something comes out of it. At least I might be able to salvage this one. I can get two pieces from it. Let's move on to the background. One of the advantages of having your entire design on paper, especially when the background is more free-form, is that you can draw some lines here and use them as a guide. Or you might simply want to start gluing pieces and fitting them as you cut. Sometimes I do it one way, sometimes the other. In this case, I'd like to try some trencadis style shapes to give the design some harmony. It's not necessary to mark it on the base because since it's exactly the same size, I can draw it from here and then glue it in place. Step 3. Grouting. I chose white grout because I want to neutralize the background and make the central figure stand out. In a bowl, put a sufficient amount of grout powder and gradually mix in small amounts of water until you achieve the consistency of peanut butter. You should add the water little by little to avoid making the mixture too runny, because if that happens, you'll need to add more powder. The consistency can change completely in an instant. You might think it needs a lot more water, but it doesn't. You need to make sure all the lumps are gone and the mixture is smooth. I like to add a little bit of PVA glue. It's optional, but it gives a more compact finish in the end. and also adds an adhesive property to the grout, because pure grout isn't adhesive. The compact effect helps reduce the amount of dust it releases later. You can apply this by hand or with a rubber spatula. We apply a generous amount across the entire surface. This is a broken kitchen spatula. I like to reuse. We spread it in all directions to make sure every space is covered. Keep moving the excess around, so it's easier to clean at the end. Now we have our project with the entire surface covered in grout. We'll let it dry for a few minutes and then clean it. It's dried a bit now, so we are going to moisten a sponge for cleaning. I like to wring it out almost completely. We clean and remove the excess grout. The idea of this step is to remove all the extra grout and also reposition any grout that might have been missed in those spaces. We rinse once more, using circular motions to ensure even coverage. And now the edges. I leave the leftover grout until the end, in case I need to do any finishing touches. For example, I might want to cover that hole. This needs to be done quickly because the grout is drying, and whatever we don't do now will be harder to clean later. Let's check how the other side is doing. I like to clean it, so it has a nice finish on the back as well. We check everything in detail and done. I let it dry for a few minutes. In this case, it's almost grout-free, but we'll give it a final wipe with a lint-free cloth. I like to reuse old socks. Always wear gloves when grouting and a face mask when mixing the powder. Grout is toxic. It's not good for your health to breathe in or have it come into contact with your skin. The more careful and precise you are, the better.